In order to understand global illumination, we first need to discuss the differences between direct and indirect lighting. Direct lighting is exactly what it sounds like. It's light that's coming directly from a light source. So anything in our Cornell box is receiving direct lighting. Indirect lighting, on the other hand, is light that's bouncing off an object that's receiving direct lighting. And currently, we don't have any of this in our Cornell box. We could see that our light is hitting the statue really evenly, but we don't have any kind of bounce light. If I rotate around to the side, we could see that our statue doesn't have any red coloration, even though it's very close to this wall that's red and is receiving a lot of direct light. We would expect some level of color bleed if we had indirect lighting. In Unity, only static objects, that is, objects that will never move, can receive indirect lighting. Indirect lighting is calculated before the game is played. So in order to see our objects with indirect lighting, let's go ahead and set them to static. I'm going to select my Cornell box, zoom out here so we could see the whole lighting situation change as soon as I hit static. I'm going to come over to the inspector and I'm going to tick the static box. Notice that I get a window that's asking whether or not I want to change the children under my Cornell box, and because this is just an empty group with all of my primitives underneath it, I definitely do, so I'm going to click on yes. And then after a moment, we could see that the lights have changed. So I'm going to deselect everything, kind of zoom in here. And so the major difference are that our shadows are no longer kind of that flat gray that they were before. We could see this especially in the shadow cast by our statue. It now has a pinkish hue, and then the top of our box kind of has a warmer tone as well. Now, I only set the Cornell box itself to static, so even though we're getting this really nice color information here, oh, and also the shadow cast by our piece of wood is getting a little bit of a green hue, even though our Cornell box is getting all this lighting information, our statue still has these flat gray tones. We're not getting any coloration on it, and that's because these objects aren't set to static yet either. So I'm going to go ahead and tick the box for our statue. You may have noticed in the lower right hand corner that there was a little bit of a loading bar, and that was actually Unity baking the light maps in the background. It's usually a pretty quick process, with the first initial bake being a little bit longer than the others, but Unity is able to do all of its baking in the background so you can continue to work as it does its thing. Now let's deselect this statue and zoom in a little bit. And there we go. We could see that there are now some pinkish elements on our statue, which is great. Let's go ahead and make our plank of wood and our door static as well. And yes, we want to change their children. Now let's take a peek at what we have. And yeah, there's some great green color bleeding here on the other side of the plank. So when game objects are set to static, what Unity does is it bakes a light map for them. Now light maps are like a second set of textures that are overlaid onto the main texture. So in order to see what these look like, I'm going to select this statue, I'm going to go into the lighting tab, and I'm going to click on the objects map tab. And there we go. We could see the light map information that's been baked for our scene, and right here is the specific section that's dedicated to our statue, and we could actually see the UV map for that statue right here. So this map gets overlaid onto the statue and we get this really nice naturalistic looking light. Now you're probably thinking to yourself that this is all well and good, but there's this large glaring issue, and that's the fact that indirect lighting can only be applied to static objects. That's all well and good for environments, which are composed of static objects, but games have a lot of dynamic objects, not the least of which being the character. So how do we get the player to be able to run around these really nice looking scenes, but still feel like they belong? Now this is a question that we are going to answer, but before we do that, I want to touch on the subject of our next clip, which is emissive lighting.